actually my going back to Dan Hydes, who was the poet that we looked at the first day. And this is a poem that was written. We tried to analyze this poem in various ways, and I'll just remind you of this poem. This transport I eat with Abel my son. If you see my older son Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I. We talked about the kind of fragmentary nature of this poem. We talked about its biblical references. We talked about the idea of taking or putting the Holocaust in this context, particularly the idea of families being separated, and the idea of trying to communicate a message, which is ultimately where the poem ends, right? It ends with, tell him that I. This idea that you're going to communicate something to someone. In this case, it's a family member, right? It's communicating a message, I love you, or I miss you, or here I am, or something about it that's talking about the situation in which which Eve ostensibly is. I also mentioned that the first day of class that this poem is derived in part from real letters. That is, people actually wrote letters very much like this in an attempt to communicate to the future, right? Sometimes to communicate to their families or friends. And I'll just read one just to remind you. Please toss this note in the nearest mailbox. It's now morning. We are in the railroad car with the whole family. We're leaving with the last transport. Plansk is cleansed of Jews. Please go to the Bam family on 6 Niska and send them regards. Yours truly. A letter thrown from a deportation train on the way to Auschwitz, found by somebody, kept, and eventually made its way to Yad Vashem, which is the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Site and Museum, and among other archival documents, it was stored there. The letter was never delivered to its intended audience, but it illustrates something, and this is the point that I'm kind of going to begin with regard to Ceylon as well. It illustrates, I think, a very fundamental human desire to communicate something to the future. We saw this with Primo Levi, we saw it with the memoirs we were reading, we saw this, I think, with Ceylon's Bremen speech. The idea of not just suffering a historical event, right, being a witness to something, but an attempt to convey that to the future, to convey some message, to tell people, I'm in this railroad car, this is actually happening, our whole family's being deported right now, right? The kind of urgency and presence of someone who's a historical witness and the attempt to convey this, this message to the future. Now, this is not something that's limited by any means to the Holocaust. In fact, I would argue, in fact, there's something very fundamentally, perhaps, maybe very fundamentally human about this desire to communicate. I'll give you a couple examples. This is in 2000. This is, you may remember the story of a Russian submarine that sunk off the Barents Sea. The whole crew actually perished, and they were 300 feet or so below the surface of the ocean. The crew suffered because they had no oxygen, but they survived for a brief period of time. And before they died, they wrote letters. They wrote letters to their families. They wrote letters to the future. It was an attempt to communicate something about the situation they were in. Now, granted, this is an entirely different situation than being in a deportation train. And I'm not saying that we need to compare them in terms of basically who caused what. It's not about that. It's actually kind of extrapolating something bigger about a very basic human desire to give a message or convey a message to the future, to tell someone, your family, your friends, even people you don't know. In the case of Herman Kruk, right? A letter to the future of trying to say something about the situation you're in and the fact that there's no one right there who you can tell because they're all going to die. They're all in a deportation train, or in the case of these men, they're all in a submarine. All the crew from the 6th, 7th, and 8th compartments went over to the 9th. There were 23 people here. We made this decision as a result of the accident. None of us can get to the surface. I'm writing blindly, right? The sense of I'm writing literally in the dark. I'm writing blindly in the dark, but I'm also writing, to my family blindly. Another example. This is a note that was scrawled in West Virginia in 2006. You might remember there were a bunch of miners that died in a catastrophe. They were trapped. They couldn't get out. And so this is a letter that was written. It says, tell all I see them in the other side, Junior. It wasn't bad. I just went to sleep. I love you. So this is, the person who wrote a note. I mean, it's written in a way that you can see it's pretty scrawled because it was in the dark, right? And this is essentially a communication. I mean, this is what Ceylon would call a message in a bottle. It's an attempt to convey a message, in this case, obviously to a family. This particular person didn't make it, they died. The letter was found by the body when they managed to get down there into the mine. It's not completely unlike the desire that Hermann Kruk had. Again, the context of what caused the situation, different. A natural catastrophe, a technological catastrophe, here a human catastrophe, right? This is the case of Kruk. He was in a ghetto. He buried this material in the Vilna ghetto at the last moment before he left. But it's the same human desire. It's the same desire to preserve something and bear witness to the experience that you're in and the attempt to communicate to some future. To those who may find this material, the materials gathered here, the chronicle, along with all the documents, manuscripts, and other texts, were collected, written, and preserved in the most difficult days of my life, from 1941 to 1943. I beg the honest discoverer to respect my wish, preserve the materials, and carefully ship them to my friends or relatives. And he, as you know, was executed on September 18th, 1944. The manuscripts were found. They were subsequently published. And in a sense, in a way, his very last desire, which is for these manuscripts to be preserved and read, was in fact honored. So, what does Ceylon say in the Bremen speech? Something, quite like this. He talks about poetry as not really about aesthetics, it's not really about metaphor. We already know that Ceylon is not writing metaphorical, symbolic, allegorical poetry. We talked about the fact that it's deeply rooted in experiential reality, right? It's deeply rooted in the experiences of him and his family, being his parents being killed, his town being ravaged, and the trauma of dealing with the Holocaust. And poetry for him becomes, as he says in the Bremen speech, a kind of orientation, a kind of a way-finding device, a kind of compass, you might say, in a world that's been utterly destroyed. But he has this idea of a poem, and this is what helps us to understand the sense of trying to communicate, to the future. He has this idea that a poem is like a message in a bottle. And we have to understand this because there is a metaphorical thought here, but it's also, I think in Ceylon's sense, he's thinking very, very literally. He says, reachable, near and not lost, there remained in the midst of all the losses this one thing, language. And in this case for Ceylon, it's the German language. He wrote in German, and despite everything that happened, despite the ferocious brutality of the German language, the calculated brutality, the idea of the dehumanizing aspects of the language, calling people pieces, right? Stücke, or Figuren, puppets. Despite all this, the language remained as contaminated and as vicious, but in some ways also rejuvenated in some sense. The language remained not lost in spite of everything. But it had to pass through its own answerlessness, pass through frightful muting, pass through the thousand darknesses of death-bringing speech, essentially pass through this kind of muting, this way in which the Nazis had appropriated the language as death-bringing speech, right? The Wannsee Conference protocols, that's death-bringing speech. The idea of this very euphemistic way of talking about, the annihilation that was going on. And essentially, the language, in many ways, had this frightful muting, right? The idea that it had to survive this real deep and dreadful warping. And then he talks about writing poetry. He said, why write poetry in German? I mean, of all things, to write poems in German, the language of the perpetrators. He imagines it's not really about poems as, works of art or beauty, but poem becomes an ethical relationship. It becomes an attempt to communicate. So just like those letters that people wrote and dropped out of trains, leaving for Auschwitz, or in some ways like the letters that I think the miners or the Curtis, the submarine, the men in the submarine wrote, or even, as you'll see in a second, people who had experienced other catastrophes wrote. The poem functions here as a message in a bottle, an attempt to communicate. A poem as a manifestation of language can be a message in a bottle, sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that it somewhere and sometime will wash up on land. They're making towards something, poems. Poems are making towards something. Toward what? Towards something standing open, something listening, perhaps toward a you. So this message in a bottle. I mean, a message in a bottle literally means that. Imagine you have a bottle and you put a little message in it, like it just says something about your life, maybe what you went through. Maybe it's the experience of, the death fugue, or it's the experience of the suffering. And you put it in a little bottle and you cap it and you drop it in the ocean and it goes sailing away. That's what he's thinking of. And somewhere in the world, on some other country perhaps, some other place, some other time, someone would find this bottle, they look at it, they open it up, they take the message out and they read it. So it requires this other thing. It not only requires someone to have written the message and the chance that it could be found, but it also requires someone to actually receive it, right? It requires a receiver. And that's the absolute critical thing. I mean, this is why Primo Levi had this horrible dream in Auschwitz. Not so much about the horrors he was actually experiencing in Auschwitz. It was the horror of not having a you, someone to listen to his story. Right? It was the horror of, I just went through all this stuff that was absolutely horrendous, and no one cares. Right? So this is why Celan imagines the poem as this sort of dialogue, as this connection between someone who's telling something about their experience at the edge of death, perhaps, and the fact that it has to be received. If it's not received, no one will ever know. Right? If Herman Kruk's diaries were lost, we never know about it. And it raises kind of a very fundamental question. How many were lost, right? How many other people wrote diaries just like this and buried them and they were never found? How many other people also had things to convey, these messages, right? How many other people scrawled notes but they were never found? Or perhaps they didn't have a pen. Or the message was lost. It was just simply evaporated, right? There's some sense here about the kind of tremendous fragility of this communication. I mean, in the ocean, things sink. They're never found. And the idea here is that he's trying to imagine a poem as this speech that transcends time and place because it reaches out to something. It reaches out to other people. It reaches out to other countries. It reaches out to people in a different geographical and historical moment. It reaches out to people who weren't there. That's, I think, the absolute fundamental thing. And this is why all these memoirs and all these poems and all these things we've been talking about, historical, they're not really historical because they're also attempting to make some kind of connection with a given present, right? So, I mean, who's toward what? Toward something staying in the open, listening perhaps toward you. I mean, this is meant, it's meant as you. I mean, I think Celan is very, very clear here. I mean, he may in 1958 not have imagined that, at UCLA in 2010 we'd be talking about this, but essentially this is what he's saying. He's saying that all these poems and all these writings and all these experiences that you've been learning about and reading are all about this relationship. They're not just something to be looked at, but they're something to be related to. Here's one more example that I think that just to put it in a very broad comparative context. Oda Yoko was a survivor of Hiroshima. As you know, Hiroshima was one of the atomic bombs dropped there. She died a number of years later of radiation sickness. She began writing frantically between August 1945 and November 1945, basically to convey the experiences of what she suffered. She wrote the book called City of Corpses in this very brief period. She writes, I was living at the time on a razor's edge between death and life. I had lost everything I owned that day in the conflagration that devastated Hiroshima. I hadn't even a single sheet of paper. I got yellowed paper peeled from the soji of a house, toilet paper, 2 or 3 pencils. Death was breathing down my neck. If I was to die, I wanted to first to fulfill my responsibility of getting the story written down. Getting the story written down, right? It's again the same idea of a message in a bottle, this idea of communication, this sense of writing, not so much even for yourself, but for someone else, for some future, for someone else who would come along and then learn about or understand. Now, again, completely different context for what caused these deaths. Natural disaster, warfare, technical disaster, deportations. But I think they all evidence something very common, and it has to do with this idea of communication to some future. The idea of some kind of obligation that we have to people in the past, and this connection. This is this kind of very fragile and tenuous connection. Yeah. So, me see if there's anything else from Ceylon that I want to say. Yeah. If you look at this, if you have your reader, I mean, you can look at the speech. I mean, I just take you through a couple of the points about it. Ceylon he didn't write a lot about his poetry. That is to say, he didn't write a lot explicating his poetry. But this is one of the probably only speeches that I think is very palpable, where he's trying to understand the work of why am I writing these poems? You know, what's the use of writing poetry after the Holocaust, right? So thinking about that quote from Adorno that it's barbaric to write poetry after the Holocaust, Ceylon, of course, doesn't buy that. In fact, he does write poetry, but poetry here is by no means about beauty, which is perhaps the kind of very narrow band that Adorno was thinking about it. Poetry is about an ethical relationship for Ceylon. It's about the possibility of a dialogue, of a handshake or a connection. So he says that he tried to orient himself after the war. And so the very first couple paragraphs are about this topography. There's people you may or may not have heard of. Martin Buber, perhaps you have, a very famous Jewish philosopher. But other people you may not have heard of. He says that poetry begins by a kind of topographical sketch, trying to organize, where he is and all the things that have been destroyed. And this is important because all these landscapes we've been talking about, Vilna, Bukovina, Ternowitz, Warsaw, but all these areas had been destroyed. They were gone. They didn't exist anymore. They had been not just people, but institutions, cultures, languages, everything had been destroyed. And so he begins by trying to think topographically, right, in order to find these points of orientation. And eventually, there's just nothing left. This is not satisfactory. You can't use the remains of the present because there really are no remains. But the one thing that still exists, he says, so despite, institutions, houses, cultures, all these things are the people, all destroyed. The one thing that's left goes back to this issue. The one thing that's left is a language, right? The one thing that still existed. And it more or less continued as it was. I mean, it's the same German language in 1920 as in 1933, as in 1942, as in 1945, as in 1958. It's the same language. It's the same German language, capable of the same kind of expressiveness, the same sort of words. And so the question is really about the kind of use that this language would be put to, how it would be manipulated, right? How it would be transformed. Could it be something that's commemorative and memorial, or is it something brutal and violent and uprooting? So if the language remained, despite these thousand darknesses of death-bringing speech, that it tried to capture, it had to capture, in some sense, to capture that which happened. And he says the language passed through all this, enriched by all this. And he says enriched in quotes, somehow greater, because now the language could be used to express this historical event, the broad historical event of the Holocaust. So on the next page, he talks about, why write poems? Why? At first, it's about orientation, right? To orient myself, to find out where I was meant to go, to gain direction. But poems for him aren't timeless things. They're not things that transcend time. They're not things that are outside of time. They're things that are very much time-bound. They're bound to, and this goes back to the reason why so many of the poems that we look at for the class are marked with a time and a place. Because they're really calling up very specific coordinates of experience. They're not things that are autonomous, that stand outside of time and space, that are abstracted in a vacuum. It's not that at all. They're very, very bound to particular experiences in particular places. Vilna Ghetto, September 12th, 1943. It's that time-space coordinate, right? So this is why a poem isn't timeless. It's utterly bound to time and place. He says it may lay claims to infinity. It seeks to reach through time, through it, not above and beyond it. To reach through time. That is to kind of go through time in order to get somewhere. And this is all about making that connection. A poem as a manifestation of language and thus essentially dialogue can be a message in a bottle, sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it could wash up on land, on heartland perhaps. Poem in a sense are underway. They're making towards something. Toward what? Toward something standing open, occupiable, perhaps toward an addressable thou, towards an addressable reality. The German here for thou is du, which is what I translated here as toward a you, a capitalized you. It's not a thou as in the sense of a holier than thou, or a kind of godlike thou. It's a do in a very personal, kind of communal, and really very, a very personal sense. So a poem is making toward a you. And this is that fundamentally dialogical aspect. A poem as dialogue, a poem as connecting to other people. The story that's been said, but that needs a listener. The poem that's been composed, but needs a reader, right? So every single time here, it's about that connection that's being made, or the failure of that connection, because it could be lost. It's like a message in a bottle. It may never be found. Questions or thoughts? So that, I think, is sort of the ethical, I guess, the fundamental sort of ethical core maybe at the heart of this class, and perhaps at the heart of sort of what we've been doing the past 5 or 6 weeks, and is really trying to think of our relationship to this information, to these messages. All right. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And this is the question that I want to deal with. I'm going to leave this open so we can actually write down some things. A couple of things about the Cambodian genocide, just by way of introduction. Again, this is not going to be, this is not comprehensive, this is not complete. One could do an entire class on the Cambodian genocide, and I'm also, I should say, not an expert in it. But what I am interested in, for the purpose of this class, is how we draw connections, historical connections, structural connections, and so forth. The Cambodian genocide, just by way of introduction, hopefully you read the chapters from Samantha Power's book, took place between 1975 and 1979, orchestrated explicitly by the Khmer Rouge, who were a radical communist party that came to power in 1975, seized power under the leadership of Pol Pot, and basically had an idea that everyone in the Cambodian society should become essentially agrarian peasants. They would get rid of money, they would get rid of the financial system, they would get rid of banking, they would get rid of private property, they would get rid of anything that was held, like houses, cars, anything that was personal. They would get rid of schools, because they thought schooling was indoctrination. And most of all, they'd get rid of religion. At the time, Cambodia had a number of religious minorities. It had a Muslim minority, it had a Christian minority. It also had a very large number, about 60,000 Buddhist monks. And it also had a significant number of different ethnicities living in Cambodia, particularly Vietnamese, Thai, and Chinese nationals. The Khmer refers to the native Cambodian ethnic group. That's what the Khmer is. And calling themselves the Khmer Rouge, rouge referring in French to red, also connotes the colonial history of this region. As you might know, that France was there before. And calling themselves the Red Khmer was also, I think, a specifically militaristic idea of recolonizing this land and essentially reappropriating it for the minority that used to live there, or not used to live there, but the minority that they thought was the superior one, meaning the Khmer. So the Khmer refers to an ethnic minority that they thought was the native superior group in Cambodia. So what had happened was, not only did you get rid of religion, get rid of money, get rid of property, you also had the Khmer Rouge orchestrated an evacuation of all the major cities in Cambodia, because they thought that you had to go back, they wanted the population to go back to the agricultural roots, till rice, and basically all the things of modern society would be rejected. This sounds in some ways extremely, maybe very backwards, kind of baffling to us, maybe maybe crazy in different regards. But it was a policy, an ideological policy that was orchestrated, and it wasn't entirely clear, I think, from the very beginning as to whether this would be genocide. Relocation, not necessarily genocide. Ideas of making a classless society, not genocide. Getting rid of religion, not genocide. Unless you begin to get rid of the people themselves and the practitioners, and you orchestrate a policy to eradicate a minority based on ethnic reasons, religious reasons, racial reasons, and other kind of group affiliations. But That is, in fact, what happened. And it happened very quickly in a period of about 4 years, where policies were put in place that resulted, and we don't know the exact numbers here. Numbers have generally been given around 2 million Cambodians killed in the course of 4 years. Some numbers say it's more like 800, 900,000. Others say it could be as high as 2.5 million. One of the things that's been going on at a number of universities in the United States is they've been going back to Cambodia using different kinds of infrared photography and other ways of understanding the ground. So kind of archaeological, geographic, and computerized models to basically investigate the mass graves and figure out how many people actually are in there. And right now the numbers are somewhere around 1.3 to 1.5 million people. So this is already, in terms of just the sheer numbers, one begins to have some sense of the approximation with regard to the Holocaust. And one also begins to have an approximation certainly based on, I think, racial, religious, ideological reasons. But there are a number of other, I think, parallels, a number that we should articulate. And I wanted to get those on here because it helps us perhaps to see sort of where are the limits of how we can draw these historical parallels and also, you know, which ones are ones that we want to investigate further. So, I mean, if you had to say, if someone asked you, I mean, what's the relationship between the Holocaust and the Cambodian genocide? Is there one? I mean, for sure, there's not a historical connection to say, so to speak. It wasn't as if Nazis were in Cambodia and there were also no Jews in Cambodia. So clearly the relationship is not the same perpetrators and victims, right? It's a different set of perpetrators, different set of victims. It's also a different time. It's not 1945, it's 1975. It's not Germany or Europe. You know, it's Cambodia. So where do we find parallels? From your reading, what's similar? Please.
The U.S. had warnings of both the Holocaust and the Cambodian genocide, and they specifically noted that there were not enough evidence showing of the genocide, though they had journalists in the areas that gave proof.
Yeah, I think this is, and this kind of goes to Samantha Power's thesis, which I think is worth, you know, exploring a little bit more. One of the things that she says is that the U.S. knew. The U.S. had knowledge. They had, even though Cambodia had closed, had actually sent all foreign journalists out, there was a kind of a real sense of being cut off and stranded from the outside world. There were reports that were getting out primarily by other foreign media sources. And there was a significant amount of debate in the U.S. Congress and at various other information gathering agencies, particularly the CIA, they were aware of what was going on and had some sense about the scope. So U.S. knowledge did exist, but I mean, one thing I should also add to that is that one of the specific tactics in Cambodia was to radically isolate the country. I mean, a radical isolation. I have to put this down each time I type, sorry. So I want to say, yeah. So I mean, this was, I mean, a very systematic attempt that in order to carry something out like a genocide, especially in a period where you have a tremendous, a kind of ongoing globalization of the media, it was important to, in some ways, strategically isolate Cambodia. This, I think, is why, I mean, nowadays, you know, we get information almost instantaneously, right? You get, and this is, I think, happening, I mean, most interestingly, I think, is just the truly Web 2.0 revolution is the one that's been happening in Iran, right? Where people are uploading Twitter pictures, they're either blogging about it, it's YouTube videos. I mean, tremendous amount of information that we're getting about the revolution and the violence, and they're utilizing the global media and new technologies to get that information out. This is why the Khmer Rouge was, of course, these web technologies didn't exist in 1975, but the point is there's television, there's radio, there's foreign correspondence, and there's the wire service. And so cutting and isolating the country was necessary in order to have this happen. So we need to be aware also of the significance of media. Okay, so U.S. knowledge existed, but at the same time the Khmer Rouge was actively isolating the country. What other kind of parallels, maybe on other topics, in terms of how they saw victims or whatever? Right. So, I mean, the sense of, again, I will just call it. Yeah. So religious minorities, so it's my shorthand, we'll correct it later. A clear superiority of those in power and a clear designation of victims. Designation of victims based on ethnicity and based on religion. Extremely common. This is what we saw in the case of the Armenian genocide. The connection between religious and ethnic identity. Tremendously important. Almost all the Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese ethnic minorities eradicated because on racial grounds, and then on religious grounds, Buddhism and Muslim minorities eradicated. So a clear idea that this kind of fit the ideology of disposing of religion, but also of a kind of racial idea of superiority of how this political ideology would be carried out. Yeah. What else? What other parallels can be made? How about the methods? How is done?
Well, they used, like in the Holocaust, exhaustive labor, forced labor, and also death marches, which is also similar to the Armenian genocide.
Yeah. Death marches, starvation, slave labor. Yeah. All these things. I mean, death marches from the cities. So cities were evacuated. Sometimes people had to walk hundreds of miles. Tremendous amount of starvation. Actively starving the population. Active use of slave labor. And on top of that, one thing you didn't mention are torture facilities. So setting up detention centers, prison camps, and torture facilities for enemies of the state. And these enemies of the state are not always based on political ideology. In this case, it's mainly racial and religious, based on racial and religious reasons. So add that as well. What else?
They would march people out into the forest and just shoot them down.
Yeah, I mean, mass killings, right? I mean, this is important. I mean, this is made possible by technology, made possible by machine guns, and it's relatively efficient and utterly dehumanizing, right? So this is a little bit different than murder. And so it's one of those things that we've been talking about and trying to understand the concept of genocide and how it differs from murder. Murder being something that's orchestrated by more or less a small set of agents or actors killing another group, but not trying to annihilate the entire group. Maybe a murderer kills someone else, they don't kill the existence of the entire group of people that person supposedly is targeted. So the difference here between murder and genocide is critical. Is it murder or genocide? And if you remember Samantha Power's the articulation of genocide, and this goes back to the find the page. Yes, on the definition on page 62 and 63 with the Genocide Convention. The difference between genocide and murder has to do with the fact that genocide concerns groups. That's the key. And the group is based on religious, ethnic, perhaps even or political affiliation. Often things that are, often things that have been designated by the group, the superior, those in power, as inferior. So Article 2 is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the key here is murder about singular individuals, genocide's about group, and that's why the idea of them being marched out and being shot and buried in mass graves looks much more like genocide than murder. and is trying to understand this, this distinction. What other similarities do we have? Quite a number. What if we look at, I'll just read you a passage, perhaps. Go to like 117. And this is, if you have the book, it's on 117. This is, according to Powers, she's putting together what the refugees told them from Cambodia. Citizens could not move, so travel passes were required even to cross towns. Cities were evacuated at gunpoint. This sounds very similar. Ghettoization of Jews put in particular places, couldn't move out. If they did move out, they would be shot. So inhibition of movement has to be one of the same, another key connection. Right? So no freedom of movement. Next bullet point. They could not feed themselves. In most areas, the state supplied a 10 or less of rice each day. It goes back to the point already made about starvation and malnutrition. They could not learn what they chose. Only Khmer Rouge tracts were permitted. Libraries were ravaged, and speaking foreign languages signaled contamination, and earned many who dared to do so a dissonance. This is, again, very similar to what the Nazis did with the destruction of culture, right? The destruction of libraries, the burning of books. In Berlin, as soon as the Nazis took power, they burned the books of Jews, socialists, homosexuals, political dissidents. The idea of cleansing culture wasn't only about cleansing, getting rid of bodies, but also getting rid of ideas, right? So libraries being pillaged is all about the idea of trying to create a sort of a cleansed idea about thought. Burning libraries and I'll just call it that, cleansing thought. So what next? They could not, this is interesting too. I mean, this reminds us a lot of the memoir I read. It says they could not reminisce, meaning the victims couldn't think about the past. Memories of the past life were banned. Families were separated. Children were re-educated and induced to inform on parents who might be attempting to mask their bourgeois past. Cambodia, a colonial term, was replaced by the democratic, I'm not sure how to say the word, Kampuchea. So the idea of time, right, of being stranded, right? The idea that you're cut off from the past, cut off from your family, and you'd probably argue that you don't have a future either. It refers very much to the kind of thing that Primo Levi talked about, of being in the concentration camp, utterly cut off from the rest of the world, but also being cut off from those things that make you human, which is we're temporal creatures. We have pasts, we have memories, we have hopes, we have futures, and both these things were denied, right? Both these things. Can go on here. I mean, the other ones, I think we've talked about them, maybe not the one that cannot float. I mean, this is a kind of, again, maybe a puritanical one about sexual relationships, but Nazis were also very concerned with sexual relationships because they're concerned with inbreeding, they're concerned with mixed marriages, they're concerned with the contamination of the race. Something else, which is probably a connection with the Cambodian genocide. They couldn't pray. Again, religion being banned, and basically all the things that religion meant. They couldn't have private property. They couldn't have phones. They couldn't have radios. They couldn't have telephones, cars, books. All these things, private goods taken away. Very similar as well with the Nazi seizure of private goods, Nazi seizures of houses, the looting of all of the material goods of the Jews. Gathering it all up and making it part now, appropriating it for the state. So. These are private property for the state. Religion. What else was there? So all this. Are there any that we missed so far that we want to add to the list? Yeah.
Just the span they both took, which over a few years.
The quickness, yeah. I mean, essentially, it's not something that carried out over centuries. It was carried out over 4 years. In the case of Nazis, it was about 5 years. In the case of Rwanda, 90 days. Extraordinarily, really quite a compressed period of time. I mean, 4 years sounds like a long time, but I mean, in the history of a species, right, it's not very long. Other things we've missed, yeah?
Can I ask a question, actually?
Sure.
I'm a little confused because it seemed like in the power reading, she basically said that, like, the Cambodian genocide, like, when the Khmer Rouge took power, they essentially evacuated everyone from every city, from every village, and everyone was on a death march. So,
Right.
like, in Nazi Germany, like, obviously all the Aryans were left alone, and they were allowed to lead a pretty normal existence during the war. Was there a group of, like, Khmer people that were left alone, or was literally everyone taken on these death marches?
It's a good question. The idea was that the cities were the sites of modernity and the sites of capitalism, so they were kind of considered to be, like, suspect. So the only people that occupied the cities were primarily the Khmer, which was to cleanse them. Now, was there a group of people left alone? Not really, because, well, the people that were left alone were the ethnic, people who could prove that they were ethnic Cambodians, which were Khmer. But you had a tremendous amount of suffering also of the, I would say, like the general population, which is a difference with Nazi Germany, right? I mean, you're exactly right that, so to speak, the Aryan population was not asked to leave their homes in Nazi Germany. Some did because of but for other reasons, for like the fear of imminent air raids on the city, for example. So you had major cities like Berlin and Hamburg, which were abandoned at different times of the war, but that's because of the attacks during the war, not because of the will of the state. So in this case, it's almost like when the Khmer Rouge seized power, they were also a relatively small group, so to speak, that then orchestrated what was to be like an instantaneous transformation of society into this communist, classless society, and everyone was impacted by that. And so, no one, so to speak, could continue to hold property. No one could continue to be part of all these things, sort of capitalist modernity. So that's an important distinction. I mean, I think that's, in terms of we're talking about parallels here, there's a really important difference. And I think that's, it's worth mentioning. Yeah, thank you. That's good. Other parallels or even differences? Yeah.
The vocabulary of the terms and the words used to talk about the sun came down. So I know with the Nazis, the relocation or solution, I think whoever House talked about the word they used was describing the term that they were cleaning off the countryside and cleaning off the town. So it was, the vocabulary.
Yeah, this is excellent point. Excellent point. Yeah. The word that the Khmer Rouge, start talking here. The word that the Khmer Rouge used was a kind of sanitized language, similar to what the Nazis did. It's a really excellent point. A kind of euphemistic language to talk about what they were doing. So instead of Nazis talk about resettlement, removal, evacuation, special operations, final solution, things like that. They're not talking about, they don't use the word genocide, right? It's a term, a legal term that was applied later. The Khmer Rouge use similar terms. Their term on 129 is bo kol, literally to sweep or throw out, to sweep or discard, right? The idea of cleansing here, sweeping, discarding. It's exactly like combing through, right? That's the word they use in German at the Wannsee conference, is comb through. The word the Cambodians use, sweep, discard. I mean, it's extraordinary in terms of the parallel, right? I mean, a really, remarkable parallel in terms of euphemistic language, which is talking about what they, very clearly what they wanted to do. I like that. Yeah, so, yeah, I think that's a really important point. Combing through, basically the same as sweeping or discarding. Yeah.
They tortured people and, to give evidence to turn in other people.
Sure.
They documented a lot of the things that they did, just like the Nazis did. Took pictures. And
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all those things, which we'll look at in a second. I mean, the documentation. I mean, the perpetrators kept documentation of their crimes. The Nazis kept documentation of their crimes. They had essentially logbooks. They had roll call sheets. They may not have produced a lot of photographs in the same way that Khmer Rouge did, but they did. There was evidence that the Nazis created of what they did. And certainly the issue of numbering, of reducing prisoners to objects, torturing and killing, all these things are basically the same techniques. So the existence of documentation that turned people into objects to be managed, same kind of thing. Yeah.
I think for both of them, at the beginning of the genocide, they hid behind the confusion of war, whether it was civil war in Cambodia or World War II.
Yeah, I don't think it's random that these genocides have happened, I mean, not always, but primarily during times of warfare. And I think it is worth mentioning there's a difference between warfare and genocide. At no point in a war was the idea of a particular, say, like the U.S. in the war or any other country, for that matter, with the exception, I think, of Germany during the Second World War, to annihilate a group of people completely from the face of the earth. Right? The U.S. didn't have the intention, as much as we wanted to stop Nazism and the war and so forth. At no point did the U.S. have a policy of annihilating every German from the face of the earth, right? To cleanse Germans. That was not U.S. policy. It was also not the case, I mean, as horrific, and I think we need to draw parallels, certainly, between the idea of technologically achieved mass death, like in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was also not U.S. policy to eradicate Japanese from the face of the earth. This is the difference, I think, between genocide and warfare. And nowadays, with warfare, I mean, the reason why we have this thing of targeted bombing and the idea of trying to minimize civilian catastrophes as much as possible is largely because of the experience of the Second World War and the war in Vietnam. And the reason the war in Vietnam, as you know, is not really that simplistic, but the reason public consciousness changed so dramatically in the United States was because of the civilian casualties that the U.S. caused. And the fact that, children are innocent victims, elderly innocent victims, and the idea is to minimize civilian catastrophes, while we have surgical, bombing operations in the wars that we're conducting nowadays. This largely comes out of experiences of the Second World War and the Vietnam War. But again, the point here is genocide is about the systematic destruction of an entire group of people based on racial, ethnic, religious reasons. And to put all the powers of the state behind it in order to carry it out. That's the difference between genocide and war. Okay? So putting all the powers of the state in a coordinated effort to secure the annihilation of an entire group of people living within that state or areas that the state occupies. So, a couple other things. I just think we'll end with the Cambodian genocide. This is mentioned in Samantha Power's book. This is one of the major prisons. There were a number of these, but this is the most famous in Cambodia, where prisoners were taken and tortured, called S-21 prison. This is a photograph from just after the end of the Khmer Rouge in 1979. It was a former schoolhouse, kind of an amazing kind of repurposing of a building. This is you may have seen photographs like this. These are not torture photographs. These are photographs of people who were taken there. They were numbered and photographed, and all of them were killed. What we know happened at this particular location was somewhere between 16 and 20,000 people were killed. They were almost all photographed and numbered. Most of the documentation was found after 1979. And the person who was in charge of this is still alive today. And in fact, he went on trial in 2009. This is, you may not know this, but it's really quite extraordinary. He was called Comrade Duch, D-U-C-H. And he testified specifically to being involved in the crimes to kill over 12,380 people at that location that you just saw. He's still alive, and the verdict as to whether he's guilty or not will be determined in March. But what I wanted to show you, and this is sort of by way of ending here, and then we'll talk about the midterm, is this is testimony that he gave on November 25th, 2009. I'll provide a link to this if you want to see it. It's really quite extraordinary. It's fairly long. He basically talks about what happened in a very confessional mode of what he did, and also asked for forgiveness. And I think it's that asking for forgiveness that's really interesting, because this is something that I don't see a lot of when I hear and see, you know, the testimony that Nazis gave at various courtrooms and trials. Very few actually apologized for what they did. Very few kind of wanted to be redeemed or wanting to actually engage their victims. But he does, and you know, we can judge that for what it is. So the crimes, this is what he says, I'll read a little bit to you. No one allowed, or the party did not allow us to communicate with the base. According to the document, I conclude that the party was interested in the crimes. This is him talking. The crimes unto the more than 12,380 people, I still am responsible, and I will forever be liable for these crimes. Other aspects of the crimes at S21, so that's the prison we just saw, and in the capital, and at other places around there have been well debated, blah, blah, blah. Then this is, the president here is referring to the commissioner who's in charge of the trial. And so they're asking the accused, who is the guy in charge of this prison, the accused, could you please slow down a little bit for the good record? And the accused says, okay, let me explain. About my position of behavior. For Cambodian people throughout the country, before its Victory Day, the Communist Party had solemnly declared that it would only prosecute the 7 super traitors. But in reality, the party forcibly evacuated the people, many hundreds of thousands of whom were executed. They were innocent. Those people did not commit any crimes after the 17th of April, 1975. Yet that's when the genocide began. The killing went on. More and more people were put to death, endlessly, until more than 1 million souls perished. Among them, people who were outside the ranks, those who did not wish to become peasants or workers, sometimes simply because they were not able to do so, were executed. Within the ranks, party members who were associated with groups other than theirs were arrested and killed, so that their people could be deployed to fill their places. This monumental destruction, both within and outside the ranks, is solely the crime committed by the Communist Party. I still honestly stand by the statement I made earlier at the hearing, in which I attested that Pol Pot was overjoyed and dared impose such an extremely criminal line due to the fact that he enjoyed the support of forces, especially the party forces, and so forth. I still acknowledge that I was a member of Pol Pot's force. Accordingly, I'm psychologically accountable to the entire Cambodian population for the souls of those who perished during the period of the 17th of April, 1975 until the 6th of January, 1979. I am deeply remorseful and profoundly affected by destruction on such a mind-boggling scale. I clearly understand that any theory or ideology which mentions love for the people in a class-based concept and class struggle is definitely driving us into endless tragedy and misery. I still maintain that a decision to choose which path to walk is made in the manner of science. However, its repercussions of its wrong choice will result in a lifelong remorse. Instead of being convinced that I could be contributed to the liberation of the nation as people and having hope that I could be serving my people, instead I had devoted myself, my strength, my heart, my intelligence, everything, including my preparedness, to sacrifice my own life for the nation and people. I found that I ended up serving a criminal organization which destroys its own people in an outrageous fashion. I could not withdraw from it. It was just like a cog in a running machine. I mean, this sounds just like Eichmann, right? I was just a cog in a running machine. The machine was running, I was just a piece. I didn't call the shots, I was just playing a part. I was following directions. I was obeying the law. This was the law. For the victims of S21 and their families, I still claim that I am solely and individually liable for the loss of at least 12,380 lives. These people, before their deaths, had included great and prolonged suffering and countless inhumane conditions. I still and forever wish to most respectfully and humbly apologize to the dead souls. I have worshipped God to honor the dead. To the survivors, I attend my acknowledgement of all the crimes which were inflicted on you at S21. I acknowledge them both in a legal and moral context. And this is where he makes his apology. He basically says, I kindly leave your door open for me to make my apologies. May I plead with you to allow me to share your immense and enduring sorrow any time. Now, there were only 16 people that survived of the some 16,000 that were there. A couple has since been interviewed, and I'll provide you the link as to whether they would accept his apology. And it's really, I think, very interesting and telling to kind of see the sense of, could you possibly accept an apology on behalf of this person who personally has said, I oversaw the death of 12,308 people. I oversaw the death of your families and everyone else. I am responsible, and I'm asking for forgiveness. I have no idea what I'd say. I'd probably say no, but you're able to make your own choices. Questions? Anyways, good food for thought. We'll see what happens. It'll be interesting in March to see if he's found guilty, and also what the verdict is and what the punishment is.